Good morning, everyone. This is Bob Ferguson, and I have with me my friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Zeller. Now, when I asked Mark about his CV, how should I introduce him? He said something very provocative. He said, well, just introduce me as a fugitive CEO.
Right.
So I present to you Wright State Adjunct Professor Mark Zeller, and today we're going to be talking about Mark's work in relationship to the development of the Southeast Iowa Regional Community Food Hub. I've been in a discussion group with Mark for more than a year, and we have been noodling around on a number of ideas, but one of them has been a sense of a rural resilient hub. What are rural areas going to do to overcome, let's say, the extraction of $4 trillion from them in the last 100 years and other little bumps in the road like that, so that rural areas can become resilient. And particularly as things change with pandemics and climate change and everything, it's probably going to be pretty darn important for local areas, and particularly rural areas, to have more of a actuality of synergy between the actors in the area, so that we can feed ourselves, we can clothe ourselves to the extent we can produce energy, we can do additive local manufacturing. So that's what we're attempting to do with this 9-county regional food web. And this is based on conceptual work and actual work done over the last 40 years by Ken Meter at Crossroads. So I'm going to turn this over to Mark and have him fill in a little bit about his background, and then we'll bring up a PowerPoint and let him talk about kind of the theoretical constructs that go into very practical application of when we're going to build a regional web. How do we do that so that it's most effective and most successful and fulfills the purpose that we want? So, Mark, great having you with me here today.
Thank you. It's a kind of an honor, and it's more of a exciting opportunity to continue my research. Okay. You probably want to know a little bit about my background, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I spent 32 years in manufacturing, rather complex manufacturing situations, 7 continents, 23 different countries, all over the world. But more importantly, it was based out of the United States. And as things changed, we had to go global in terms of our engineering designs. The industry was basically bearing technology. And what was fascinating to me during that period of time, the last 20 years of the 32 years, I wound up being CEO with a lot of little different companies. And we would go into a country, try to solve their problems for their markets, and then put a family, usually a family corporation, in charge, and then they would take off, and we could continue on in our marketing and sales. We really wanted to do it all in the United States. We could not anymore because the way the world had changed. So we had these neat, innovative ideas, and they had neat, very exciting, innovative ideas. And what I found was that there was this information flow going back and forth, and these ideas got into a situation where people would adapt them, they'd be very successful, and then they would fail. Or why would they fall flat? So what would be the cause of that? So I could give some pretty interesting anecdotal stories, but what got me into the academic side was we could see the changes coming in the 80s and the 90s of what was going to occur with the internet. And I happened to be at the university. They asked me to introduce, as a big shot CEO, they asked me to introduce this concept called the internet in the 90s. And the Gates people said, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see the same process sheet in our plant in Bangalore, India, as I see here in the Detroit area." And they said, "Well, what does that mean?" I said, "Well, one's got higher education, more support, more manufacturing assets, etc., and one doesn't." And everybody thought it was Detroit. And I said, "No, it's India." and they all kind of looked horrified. And Gates's people said that we're at the university and we're connected to this phenomena called the internet. And it's 93, I think, 1993. And Gates's people said, we don't understand what you're talking about. And I said, well, if you've ever had to travel on work all over around the world, this is no holiday, okay? This says it's over with, okay? And so at that point, there was a professor who was the first woman professor in whatever her area of expertise was at Purdue University in the 80s. And of course, there weren't a lot of women at the university. And she started to work at my operations in the United States just to help us with this concept called the internet. And to cut the story short, she got into it with the aerospace engineer who was our product design in kind of an argument. And she enticed me, look, you really need just to get to the university trying to do all these things. Now, the aerospace engineer happened to be from Purdue University. So we had this conflict. And when she said that, it became very clear that there was only one future, and that was this information flow. And we couldn't introduce all these new ideas and innovations. So when I went to the university, I'd been there to where she was practicing, what I got was, okay, there was these networks and ideas. And so we studied diffusion of innovations. We did a 5-year and then a 7-year longitudinal study with the CEO base that I had accumulated across the world. And that brought me to becoming a fugitive CEO and then ultimately an academic, okay, because it was a better deal. So at the end of, as while I'm doing that, I get the opportunity to do postdoctoral after a PhD, accumulating a PhD, and they want me to apply this in terms of regional economic development with a grant from England and Canada and Japan. And I raced to that as an old man, 54 years of age at the time, and all of a sudden discovered that this is what I'd been looking for, was this integration of information flow and what was really happening. So I specialized and have been specializing in methodologies for research and locating what would be actors. 90% of all innovations and ideas were based on social acceptance. They weren't based on technology. That was one of the research findings that is still well developed in science today. There's a scholar called Everett Rogers who has done a lot on that in diffusion of innovations and adaptive technology. It's quite historical. So that kind of gives you a brief, but maybe too long background.
No, it's great. Well, Everett Rogers is our own in Iowa State, doing his work on hybrid corn in the 40s. So yeah, we're on Everett Rogers. So
let me mention, so if I go to the local DuPont corn distributor here where I'm at, and I talk about hybrid seed corn and Rogers, they have no clue of what I'm talking about. So my students are kind of lost, saying, well, why wouldn't they know? And I'd say, well, because diffusion is based on the social system, and this is just corporate business. Right. Believe that.
So and thus you expose a key difference between what we're attempting to do and the incumbent system. But we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time. So we'll just kind of put that on the parking lot and come back to it. So this is not a 2 or 3 hour thing, which could easily be. I'm going to pop up some slides and let Mark go through a little bit of an understanding of his methodology and what he's found. And then we'll have a discussion about what are the implications for an attempt to build, in essence, a viable, economically viable food system in the form of a food web, which would involve production, growing, manufacturing, transportation, IT, education, social diffusion of why should you buy local rather than from afar, all these kinds of things that in the sum create this web of tight and powerful relationships. And that, when I looked at Mark's work, that's something that just really stuck out to me, that, as you said, 90% is relationships and social infrastructure, not actual technical innovation. So with that, let me go ahead and try sharing my screen. Okay, so over to you, Mark.
Okay. Basically, you've got lots of interaction, and what you can see here in this little model, and what this model is, the 30-second introduction for some of my students. So they get this within 30 seconds. And the biggest impression, of course, is the fact that these little edges are going back and forth between vertices, which is what we call it in graph theory. But more importantly, maybe they could be organizations, they could actually be just individuals. And once the students recognize that we're actually looking at that kind of interaction, I actually give them assignments, go out and sell brochures to people on campus. And they go, well, what are you trying to show me? And they come back and they discover that persistence makes a big difference if they're trying to get connection to another person. And when we start talking about institutions, we start talking about the size of the number of people in the institutions, and that they're made up of a whole series of actors, has a real significant thing in terms of this porous network around each actor in the institution. What I mean by that is, if the key actor doesn't comply, go out a couple nodes out, a couple vertices out, and you can probably go right around the key person. It has a major, now the key person would be maybe the dominant actor on the way things are done today. Again, it's all done in a collaborative manner. We have to kind of approach that in a more 21st century. So this kind of gives you just a good example of how we analyze them. Of course, you can see social structures. One of the interesting things is network theory is very applicable in terms of regular, normal, what I call heavy duty science. You draw graphs, and network theory is actually, network analysis is actually graph theory, or graphs and how you draw graphs. Okay, so you just draw a quick graph of people we're interacting with. Now, the people interaction can be inside an organization, or can be just the smallest unit of analysis. And this course talks about obtaining the perspective then that, gee, we can look at this, look at what we want to do in a manner of all the individuals that can be evolved, which is important because you've got these different perspectives. So this kind of goes over the benefits of looking at these patterns. You get these patterns of social ties. Now, one of the interesting things, the students come back and they all of a sudden discover in social ties that we can actually measure trust, and trust turns out to be the predictability of how the other actor is going to act. So we may not choose to interact with them, but we understand how much we can share what we know. And we also come up with this concept of boundaries. And so every person has a set of value systems, et cetera. So you have what's called a rational decision-making, or rational boundaries, or bounded rationality if we're looking at networks. So you can see these things. Bob, the next slide if you can. Okay. And then there are all kinds of ways of measuring and labeling some of this. The betweenness between people, the amount of betweenness. And of course, the most important thing I always found in this was the broker, the person that had their group of people and they kind of dominated, and another person, and you can only go through that broker. That's not necessarily the case, because the entire population of the earth is your network. Okay. So,
Right.
So you can break it down all the way down, so you can actually go around complete networks and doing some of this. So you can see some of the categories. We can talk about that sometime in the future. Let's go further.
Well, Mark, one thought about that is, when we're thinking about creating essentially a robust local food system that in essence can compete with the incumbent system, this point of using this network theory and using the capacity of nodes to connect with each other and move around an incumbent broker seems to me a very central idea, isn't it?
Yes. Do you see the word boundary spanner there?
Yep.
Okay. Now that expands, and this is just the general introduction. That expands, and I'm glad that we stopped at this slide because you just uncovered a really interesting area. Let's go to the next one.
All right.
All right, so this is a real simple grid. This isn't as complicated as all the words on the previous slide, but you can see how you would go about then. It's just a plain grid spreadsheet, but you would also have another layer that would be organizations, and then you could have another layer in rationality, or how people make decisions, and values and beliefs. You can have another layer on issues. You can look at all three of those layers and you can actually see the direction you're going to go in, or could go in. Okay, go ahead, Bob, next. And it looks like this when you're done. And you can have it, but of course, not without the detail. It doesn't really make any difference, because the detail basically is the collective collaboration. And then ultimately, collaboration moves into partnerships between actors. So we'll just flip on further, okay, to the next one. And if you're looking at the military, and this is a military model without going into all the massive detail, this was a huge one that the government did. So let's go to the next one.
That looks a little scary, right?
Well, yeah, but they're looking at the world when they did that.
Right.
And the colors, we don't want to venture what the colors meant, okay, in the network, but it's one to show that it expands. This is just a simple problem. So one afternoon, my wife was trying to work through the management or governance of a condo association. And I decided that if she was just going to solve this problem, I think it was new concrete driveways for everybody. Okay. She was having to interact with all these different people who own different condos. And I decided I would try this method out. And as you can see, I started to put weights and things here, which of course I'm not defining right now on this, but you can weight these directions, etc. And then of course you have to know what you did and why you were doing it. This particular one did show that the people who were the most cooperative required 3 interactions, and the people who were worst cooperated required 3 interactions, and everybody else didn't. Okay. And it was just in a 2-hour period. But I would just use this as an example of how easy it is that you could see the pattern of where the time was spent and then where the efforts were spent. These are just some of the reference, and we're all set and done. Okay. Okay. Well, at the end of about 3 years worth of work doing a postdoc after my PhD that we accomplished in terms of information flow and communication systems, I was asked if we could quickly summarize some of the findings. And of course, what this is just a presentation poster with references, probably very hard to read, but I think, Bob, you could probably zoom in to what would be my left-hand corner, of the document, the opposite side of the references. Yeah, now slide to the left just a little bit. Okay. And why we called it the cognitive limits was that we were actually exceeding the capacity of every actor in these projects. And so we had a cluster-based economic development. So it's very important, and this is what the grant was paying for, okay? It was very important that you understand that everybody has a network. So every human being has a network of their own, whether they realize it or not. It's usually their significant other, and then close relationships, usually with their family members, and etc. So you have these levels, and you can take, let's take 6 family members, or your 6 closest people, counting yourself. So 5 people plus yourself. Okay, each one will have their own networks. That you may be part of it, but each person will have them. And if you're looking at it, you can look at it then as their network and your network, and that's when you use the word cluster. So you're nesting networks. You're always nesting networks. You can never have a clear, clean network because it's made up of the total cognition of each actor. So if we look back, if we just scroll down there, Bob, international limits due to interaction limits due to cognitive information. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It-
Good. Got it.
okay. You can see a more robust social network of a cluster may exceed the ability of each human agent. And that's normal. That is the normal way as a species or as humans we interact. So this has a big situation on what does he mean when he's doing an entrepreneurial act or they're trying to share information. We scoot over to the middle column and go straight up again. This is what we were summarizing. We did network perspective determining through the analysis, and we had survey interviews, observational analysis, okay, which gave us themes, okay, very, very qualitative. The surveys gave us good quantitative data, and we documented the research and we applied it to the social network analysis, and you can start to see this is just an example. But the results were rather significant, and we're going to concentrate on that because that's what means will really help the whole program. The meta results in this case, these were the different studies, those 4 bullets there. The greenhouse cluster, which is rather significant because it involved Canada and northern Michigan and Ohio, measuring social networks of the local development agents, because they were always these government agents. And we used Etzkowitz's triple helix, which was academe, governments, and enterprise businesses to look at the models to lay over the networks. And then we surveyed besides the interviews, we surveyed regional industry structure. And what we found was these structural holes. The entrepreneurs were actually filling in those holes or working as brokers, expanding boundaries and sometimes bridging boundaries. Cognitive information overload was very, very common with each actor. Just tell me what I want to know, quote, tell me what I want to know. We don't know what you want to know. Tell me what to do and I'll do it, or I'll drop out, okay? We had service gaps. We looked at the limitations of working memory, which was the most important thing. And fascinating, the limitations of the institutions. The institutions, does the board work for the board, or does the board work for the stakeholders of the institution? Bob, that's important in terms of governing. Okay, so you have these governing boards that start to work for themselves, literally as groupthink and not for the stakeholders. Boundaries of shared cultural thinking and values and beliefs and behaviors, the way we look at it that way. And then membership boundaries. And if we flip over to the next column, Bob, we get all the way up, because otherwise, okay, so we started focusing, what did these findings mean? Where do we need to do more research? And we did I did a survey of these CEOs, et cetera. And what we found was the CEOs of these organizations, this is one of the many studies that we did in those 4 bullet points, we found that there were patterns of complexity in social structures, that the CEOs, the one person in charge, they were fragmented in interactions, okay? And that it actually fit the whole small world paradigm, where you go 3 nodes out and you know everybody, or was the 6 nodes or whatever for Kevin Bacon, 3 nodes for Kevin Bacon or something. But actually, if you went back into the mental thinking, you realize the social relationships were the key factor, that everybody would know who to interact with, or they had to be built. And if we scoot down further, we actually then could see that this actually fit the cognitive limit problem. Okay, in other words, if there wasn't enough shared information, they wouldn't be able to interact. And this culminated in what you had to do in perspective if you were going to share all these different perspectives of the leadership in terms of leadership. And of course, this gives a quick explanation of how the brain works in this situation. And all the way to the right, Bob, here, the next column, all the way to the top, gives us our final summary. And then maybe you want to ask some questions. But basically, this is what we uncovered. I was excited because for the first time, I could understand the diffusion of new ideas as a CEO. I understood why these CEOs were just using heuristic patterns and making quick snap decisions. And it would be just the pattern of what they had learned. It wouldn't be based on analysis. So big corporations and financial markets were in deep trouble, okay, in terms of why they think and act the way they do based on the direction. I'm going to jump back to, does the board work for the board, or does the board work for the stakeholders? And if you bring in governance structures, we know the board does not work for the governance structures. We now have new social responsibilities. Incidentally, in the business school, they were coming out with the social responsibility of businesses at the time we were doing the subjects and this analysis. So you'll see then cognitive social calculations are limited by the complexity of the information processing. And then down at the bottom here, understanding collective economic activity. In this particular case, economic activity, let's go back up. The references I don't think we'll cover, but let's just, I'm going back, yeah. To understand the collective economic activity is where you're trading, even social relationships you're trading, forget materialism, but then money, that it's very important to look at the economic actors, or the actors as units of analysis. That's it.
That was a whirlwind tour. But the funny thing is that if you kind of relax into it and don't worry about catching all the details, you can really feel, at least I can feel, the underlying reality of this. And it does, at least in my case, comport with my lived experience. That we make progress to the extent that we're talking with each other, to the extent that the actors involved can interact. And then, of course, in an economic system, you have everything else layered on top of this. You've got kind of a multiple dimension tic-tac-toe going on that requires, and here's the thing that I think is really excites me, that kind of complexity requires analysis to be able to predict whether A or B is going to do better. And if we have to just do everything by pure experiment, do A and do B, and we'll see what happens. And it's a long way between waterholes. And we want this to happen in our lifetime, not somewhere in the great beyond. So it really seems to me extremely helpful if we can bring this academic rigor into the process. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build this thing that's built on relationships. And so this information is tremendously valuable, it seems to me. So let's wrap up with just a few thoughts from you, Mark, in terms of, okay, hopefully you'll be here with us on May 10th. And, we'll give you some airtime, to go over this so that we can utilize this in the process of putting our vision together and putting some first steps together. So maybe some thoughts on you, specifically drilling right down to this 9-county project. How do you see this being helpful?
Well, in a nutshell, all new ideas turn out to be the social relationships. Doesn't make a difference. Doesn't make any difference. You actually, if you go to buy some bad food from a particular hamburger shop, okay, I'm trying not to put names in, okay, it's a social relationship, okay. If you transact at a bank, it's a social relationship. Technology comes in place. So what we found was how many social relationships or how many interactions did it take to make the relationship? And then when do we make these bounded decisions? And of course, the easier way to look at it was, if the environment is created, the goals emerge almost immediately. You don't have to say, these are our goals, we have to do this, command and control. So instead of command and control, you collaborate and you partner. The more collaboration and more partnership, the more transparency, the smoother and the quicker everything happens.
I think that's a great place to stop. I don't want to stop because this is completely fascinating to me. But I think for the purposes of getting this out to potential participants in our May 10 meeting, we've done well. So Mark, thank you so much for doing the work and being willing to explain it to us, and also arriving here on the 9th of May for all of our initial festivities, and then being with us at the Cambridge building at the fairgrounds, Iowa State University Extension on the 10th of May.
Thank you very much, Bob.